Mark, hi. Whitney, hi. How are you both?
Hi, doing good.
Super good. Thanks, Peter. Happy to be here.
Good to see you. Good to see you. Good to see you. Okay. So you two have you're working on a lot of stuff at the moment. You've just released a massive piece, which we're going to get into. And we made an attempt to do this yesterday, so we're going to have another go today. But I'm just going to get straight into this this time. I'm not going to muck around. We're going to talk about chain of custody. We're going to talk about PayPal mafia. There's a lot of detail to this. I've read the article, which I know you've already released. Danny told me it'd take 45 minutes. It took an hour and a half. I think I need to read it probably about 4 more times to get it. There's a lot of characters, so we might have to take our time. I'm going to get you to start, Mark. I want you, firstly, if you can do as best you can, a TLDR of the story arc, so people understand the story we're going to tell in its entirety, and then we'll work our way through the various companies and people.
Yeah, 100% for sure. I mean, and just to, we totally sympathize with the this is a 17,000 word chonker. We know we've had to read it a bunch of times. There's a lot of information here, and actually, in the spirit of that, kind of for the first time, we did a sort of key takeaways at the start of the piece kind of for this reason. And it's funny, people have brought up to us before, they've tried to run our pieces through, like learning language modelers, trying to do like summations, and they like won't touch the incendiary content.
Oh, really?
Like, this is saying a bunch of mean things about people. We don't want to, parse it. It's kind of funny. So we did that for you. But yeah, so basically chain of custody, Whitney and I have been kind of on this trope for a long time. Obviously, I wrote the Bitcoin dollar, and started writing about this sort of Bitcoin dollar system in like 2021. And we've now done like, 4 or 5 something pieces, kind of in this realm. And this one, it was, kind of the very beginning of it was sort of looking at these venture capital firms behind, the infrastructure of this system. So, I guess the very, very, broad stroke summation of it is, intelligence affiliated venture capital firms are dominating the fintech industry, which, should be kind of no surprise to those sort of paying attention. But, we are now starting to kind of like name the names and really looking at this structure. So that's kind of the first bit. We talk a little bit about the funding of In-Q-Tel, the CIA venture firm, and we'll get into that more broadly. But so yeah, that intelligence affiliated venture capital firms, and then this this kind of idea of these kind of entrepreneurial social groups like Endeavor, very similar in function to the World Economic Forum's Young Global Leaders program, the Henry Crown Fellowship. Capturing basically these, CEOs of these, very important companies, at the beginning, at the incubation of these startups. And a group like Endeavor specifically functions a lot like the Young Global Leaders program, except instead of being this public sector focused, think group, it's private sector and very specifically private sector in emerging markets in Latin America. And the way that they kind of do this is they sort of hide and mask where this funding is coming from, and making it look like there's sort of this naturally blossoming private sector explosion of innovation, when in reality, all these companies are funded, by similar people, similar interests. And they lead to this sort of, as Endeavor describes it, as this multiplier effect. And making it look like there's, this sort of, amazing free market, private sector, hoorah kind of going on. But really it's, okay, wow, we got these direct connections to the likes of Edgar Bronfman Jr. and Piero Midyar, the PayPal mafia, Reid Hoffman, a lot of these sort of, intelligence and mafia connected, entities, billionaires, that have helped build the fintech environment that we live in the United States and in Europe. So yeah, like we're looking at these network mafias essentially, And unfortunately, there's a lot of connections to these sort of more notorious, blackmail rings, sex blackmail rings, such as those led by Jeffrey Epstein, which obviously, Whitney literally wrote the book on that. And then, maybe the slightly lesser known, but still very, very well known, the Nexium Group, which has direct connections to the Bronfmans. And then we sort of kind of look at, okay, we've established this trope, this private sector coup, basically, in Latin America and in emerging markets, being led by these billionaires, a small group of people. And then we kind of take a step back and we look at, like, how did we get here? What's the history? What's the decades long trip down this road? How did we get here? And we're looking at sort of how banking became sort of about information, how technology firms, Silicon Valley really became all about information. And so we looked at sort of the innovators in that field, like Citi, like Visa, like PayPal, and these people that were really instrumental in the creation of information being a commodity. And now we've gotten to the point where, like, that's quite literally true with Bitcoin. It's literally bits, it's data, and it's now a whole commodity system. So these core people that have built this sort of information banking sector are all directly connected, specifically to one of Endeavor's most important success stories, and certainly extremely important in the Bitcoin ecosystem, Zappo. Wences Casares' Zappo, which has affiliations to many of the early funders of Microsoft, eBay, PayPal, Facebook. He specifically says, Wences, that, Endeavor literally came, Linda Rottenberg, the founder of Endeavor, came and knocked on his door. And when he had no money and he was trying to find, help, knocked on his door and changed his life, as he told Reid Hoffman. So this Zappo is this incredibly important, infrastructural pillar in the Bitcoin dollar system that's directly connected and owes its success directly to Endeavor. And so we looked at this first advisory board of Zappo, which has D Hawk of Visa, John Reed of Citi, and then Larry Summers, who was, in the Treasury, in Obama's cabinet, the president of Harvard, and these three like very important figures in the deregulation of the markets in the 90s that led to 08 and the bailouts. And now they're here building this new Bitcoin bank, stablecoin connected, US dollar connected Bitcoin bank that specifically built out the best custodial situation for Bitcoin for the early years. Wences is considered the Silicon Valley's like patient zero. He orange pilled everybody very early on in Bitcoin. And here he is building the vaults underground, going into space, doing all of these things. So we're seeing all of this important stuff, incredibly influential from a regulatory standpoint, from a custodial standpoint, all of the funding being connected to these very important Silicon Valley, stalwarts. And now we're seeing them. They're here, they're in Latin America, and they are ready to sort of use the structure that they've built, the markets that they've built, to covertly dollarize the global south, via this sort of infrastructure that they built. So that's the brief overview. Obviously, that was a bit of a rant, but that's sort of that's the case of this piece. So I don't know if Whitney has anything she wants to say specifically there.
No,
but
I think we'll get into specifics later. Okay. Probably, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Yeah, and so I was trying to kind of note the pressure points of this kind of article, and I kind of had it down as obviously the Bitcoin dollar itself. And the issues that we have, or that you will have recognized with that, centralized power and influence of small groups, which is obviously something as Bitcoiners we've desperately tried to get away from. And then the role of intelligence agencies and the influence that they may be having. And we were going to record this yesterday. We've gone back a day, and I was going to get you to work through the characters, the story. But actually, I think I want to start actually at the Bitcoin dollar. I think I want to start with you explaining what it is and what it is about a Bitcoin dollar that you don't like. Where is it oppressive? What are the who is benefiting from it? So can you break down what this Bitcoin dollar is, like the mechanics of it?
Yeah, totally, 100%. It's really I don't think it's actually that foreign of a concept if you are a bit familiar with sort of the petrodollar system, which I think a lot of us, Bitcoin podcast listeners are. It's definitely something talked about quite a bit. But essentially, when the U.S. Went off the gold standard, the Nixon shock happened at the start of the 70s. Immediately, the U.S. Intervened in the Middle East, and very specifically in Saudi Arabia, established a military presence there, and began to, in effect, create a monopoly on the sale of petrol, of oil, to be done in U.S. denominated dollars, right? U.S. dollar denominated trade, basically. So it's actually quite similar, I think, the Bitcoin dollar to that. Oil is this energy commodity that, if countries, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, right, Asia, Europe, South America, anywhere really, the U.S. that wanted to, industrialize, they need oil. That's just the way it is. So there was this, this highly demanded energy commodity. And so we went in and established, a de facto monopoly on the ins and outs of the oil trade in dollars, ergo creating a situation where the U.S. can basically shovel off their highly inflating dollar now that it's cut off of this, hard money standard, and they can shovel the inflationary effects of the dollar by saying, if you want oil, you got to buy dollars first. So what should be this kind of moment where dollars, inflate and there's less and less and less demand, we've actually created artificial demand for the dollar system by forcing Asia, Europe to buy dollars first to buy oil, because everyone needs oil. So now we're in a situation where in 2020, right before that, the halving happens in May of 2020, that actually brings the relative issuance of Bitcoin below the rate of gold coming out of the ground and the rate of the targeted inflation rate of the dollar. We see oil go negative in the futures markets. We see the U.S. pull out of Afghanistan. We see all of these kind of signposts of, hey, maybe the oil market is changing significantly, and we see massive amounts of inflation. Obviously, Bitcoin crashed immediately too in March of 2020, but it 20x'd by the end of the year and went up to just about 70K. And so we've created basically the same de facto monopoly for the Bitcoin market as this energy commodity that we know that we're familiar with being this basically energy remittance market. We've created a monopoly on the ins and outs, and the volume of trade of Bitcoin is vastly dollar denominated. Whether that's through stable coins, whether that's just through USD in your bank account going into Coinbase, you got to buy dollars to buy Bitcoin, basically. Again, petrodollar wasn't a literal monopoly either, but in terms of like volume, it might as well have been. It's kind of the same with Bitcoin. Yes, you can use Euro Circle coins or whatever to buy Bitcoin, but it's such a small amount of volume that's actually happening. It's really dollars. So we've basically, no pun intended, or maybe pun intended, I don't know, but tethered the success of the Bitcoin system and the appreciation to the dollar market. And so that's kind of this analog. The Bitcoin dollar is essentially this underlying energy commodity. We've created the ins and off, the ons and off ramps being dollar denominated. We price Bitcoin in dollars. We consider it all. Yes, we say 1 Bitcoin equals 1 Bitcoin, but really we all got our charts open and we're looking at the dollar denominated appreciation of it. So we've basically created that same, that same latch of what we did with dollars to oil. We're now creating artificial demand for dollars to buy Bitcoin.
And it's a little bit different than the petrodollar in that, for example, you say I've got my chart here open up. I only know the price of Bitcoin in dollars. I couldn't tell you it in pounds.
Right.
I don't look at the pound exchange rate, but I can tell you the price usually within the last few hours what Bitcoin is in dollars.
Totally.
So even into a retail environment, we're now conditioning people into pricing it in terms of dollars. And does part of that really setting the groundwork for conditioning people that dollar is the global reserve currency?
Yeah, 100% for sure. And I think also a lot of the the Bitcoin space has really kind of pushed towards, Bitcoin's not a currency. It's a store of value. It's a unit of account. The medium of exchange is much less important. We have dollar stable coins. Why would we need Bitcoin to scale for 1 billion people to be able to buy their groceries or buy coffee? We're using it as a reserve asset, as a treasury asset, not a currency. And so, yeah, we're seeing a lot of people say that outright. A lot of the people involved in this article have really just straight up said that. David Marcus, Saylor, a lot of these people are like, hey, let's get stable coins on Bitcoin, and we'll use. Well, why would you ever spend your Bitcoin? So we've kind of pushed it into this, even a bit. The Bitcoin standard is sort of about that. It's kind of, hey, like this really, it's the new gold. Don't spend it. So we've kind of created this situation where it really functions best as a reserve asset, and the dollar can stay, for accounting purposes, for speculative purposes, for high volume purchases, for retail purchases. The dollar can kind of remain, maybe not literally backed by Bitcoin, but by just like oil wasn't literally backed by dollars, or the dollar rather wasn't literally backed by oil. But we create basically this same mechanism where demand for U.S. treasuries are being bought up by some of these, huge players in the Bitcoin space, notably these stablecoin providers. So I would argue the Bitcoin dollar system is certainly, perhaps a co-option of the potential that Bitcoin could be as being this, peer-to-peer, unstoppable transmitting technology. Now it's like we're all basically being told, no, don't spend it, don't touch it, leave it in your bank account, leave it on your cold card rather, and use stable coins, use dollars, use credit cards even. Yeah, we'll get into some more of that stuff, but that's a brief overview of the Bitcoin dollar. I've talked about it quite a bit, but it's definitely an important part of this piece because I think Zappo specifically, has basically built out the infrastructure needed for the Bitcoin dollar, very highly, secure custodian, and then this, stable coin banking, and that's kind of where we are right now.
And we're definitely going to get into that. I just have a couple more questions, and so firstly, I'm kind of split on this in that. Is the Bitcoin dollar really a gift that's fallen into the hands of the US government at a time where we're kind of seeing or heading towards the end of the petrodollar, in that we know that, say, Saudi have already declared that they will be pricing oil in other currencies. Certainly Russia is moving away from it. We know China wants to. So is this kind of a gift that's fallen into their hands? Or if you want to be ultra conspiratorial, have they created something which is better than the petrodollar?
Well, on the case of Saudi Arabia dumping the petrodollar, you could argue that Mohammed bin Salman for some time has been moving away from the dollar well before that official announcement. Basically, when he came to power, he was trying to move Saudi Arabia to a post-oil economy. He launched his Vision 2030 plan. And made overtures there that he was going to try and move Saudi Arabia away from oil and sort of make it a leader in the fourth industrial revolution, including in fintech. And we've also seen like other big actors in Middle Eastern oil specifically, like in the United Arab Emirates, for example, do kind of essentially the same thing. So I think it's something that sort of has been planned for some time. And what's interesting is that MBS, as soon as he came to power and during the Trump administration, was very close to Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who was also, we know from emails that have since come out promoting the idea of like stable coins, like an official US dollar stable coin. He actually, I think it was like a Sam Altman blog post that he shared with Steve Mnuchin of the Treasury Department, talking about, the USD coin, which, this is before Circle launched USDC, but interesting. So it's very possible that these discussions were being had like some time ago, that it's not as recent as it may appear to be based on headlines that have been coming out recently.
Totally. And this idea of we have this now highly inflating dollar, just like I think we're in a very similar position to where we were at the start of the 70s, where it's like everyone is like, oh, here comes de-dollarization, the dollar's dead, like here's BRICS, like let's go, there's an alternative now, here comes the euro. There was a lot of movement kind of like in those decades of like de-dollarization. And then what happened? Well, the petrodollar system got built up and the dollar just kicked everybody's butt. And now it's just, easily not even disputed as being the world reserve currency. But at the time, there was a lot of, speculation, quite literally, that things were going to go other ways. And now I think we're in a very, very similar spot. And I think what the lesson we should learn about the US dollar system is that it will do whatever it takes to retain sort of net purchasing power at the expense of the individual unit. That's a debt-based economy sort of requires that. It doesn't matter that the dollar has lost 99% of its value individually. As a net purchasing economy, the U.S. dollar is as strong as ever. It's versus other countries. You go travel somewhere else. There's demand for dollars everywhere, and we're seeing that now as with the digitalization of money. People in Argentina are like, "Oh my goodness, give me tethers. This is so great. It's so much better than my native currency that's inflating." That's sort of that's a signpost of that idea that even though the dollar is inflating against itself, it's still so much stronger than the rest of the world. So this idea that is this an accident? I would say it's certainly not an accident. I think the U.S. government has so much more to lose if Bitcoin does poorly. The U.S. dollar system needs a place to hyperinflate into, essentially, and Bitcoin erupts exactly out of the collapse of 2008. It just appears on a mailing list. Here it is, and it's set up to be this demand inelastic energy commodity that is a universal ledger that can store other assets on it. And here we go, and we price it in dollars, and all this hoopla that we've done for the last 14 years. Now, I just also want to say, I know you want. That does not mean I think that Bitcoin is not all the things that we think it is. I think Bitcoin is wonderful. There's a lot of greatness in Bitcoin that, it is this demand inelastic. Like if it's so useful for a government to do all of this work, or these entities, beyond, the public sector, but these people to build these infrastructures, that is also a signpost that this is very important and we should take it very seriously. But also we should just be very careful of who we let in, who we roll out the red carpet for. And what kind of infrastructure systems that we create in this Bitcoin economy, because I don't want to perpetuate the U.S. Treasury market and the U.S. government, which I feel are, frankly, kind of the biggest terrorist organization in the world. I don't want to perpetuate their debt and the defense budget of the U.S. government by using this technology that really could be used to free people.
Yeah, all I really want to add to that is that it's important to keep in mind that when the petrodollar system has been, the standard for keeping the dollar the global, or reserve currency, the U.S. has gone to war and killed millions of people to defend that. One of the likely motivations, obviously there's more than one, but one of the key ones in invading Iraq, I would argue, was the fact that Saddam Hussein, not long before the invasion, had started selling oil in euros instead of dollars and made a lot more money, showing by example to other, other OPEC members that they could make more money selling in different currencies than the dollar. And then, of course, you have the case of Libya in 2011, where Gaddafi was trying to move to a gold-backed currency called the dinar and was selling that to African countries, a lot of which either use dollars or they use, French financial stuff. And that's why you had the U.S. and France essentially lead that regime change operation with devastating consequences for Libya, which used to be the safest country in Africa, then became the most dangerous, and has been cited as an example of or a reason for why immigration got so out of control in Europe after that point. So there are cases where the U.S. government, or rather U.S. empire, is willing to go to extreme lengths to defend the dollar. So the idea that they would just sit idly by and just let dollarization happen without having some sort of plan in the works, especially knowing that they couldn't keep this going indefinitely and that the world was going to move at some point to a post-oil economy. I think it's important to keep in mind that these people have been very serious and played very dirty and created insane instability just to keep the dollar the global reserve currency, because it gives a lot of advantages just to the US. And I fully feel that they intend to keep those advantages, even if it means a different system.
Was that when Saddam Hussein started to sell oil in euros, was that pre-first Gulf War or the second Gulf War?
So this is after the 2000. This is slightly before the 2003 invasion. I forget exactly what year, but it was somewhere between 2000 and 2002, I believe. So it was after the first Gulf War.
So that was the second Gulf War.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, I was trying to understand the timeline of that, because obviously the original Gulf War was post the invasion of Kuwait. So I was trying to weigh that up.
Yeah, 91, right?
Yeah, 91. So the other question I have then is dealing with this kind of conflict of not wanting to perpetuate the US dollar and everything all the issues that you've alluded to there, Mark, with that, and as well you, Whitney, with this idea that the dollar is also super helpful to people. Like, I've been to Lebanon, people want dollars. I've been to Argentina, people want dollars. I've been to Venezuela, they want dollars. I've been to Cambodia, they want dollars. Everywhere I go, because I like to go to places where, a little bit off the beaten bush, everybody wants dollars. So there's this conflict where people want dollars. It's a more stable currency than the local currency. The digital dollar is easier for them to access, especially if there are controls over accessing dollars, as we know existed within Argentina, certainly pre-Milei. I think it was you were allowed $200 a month, and if you wanted more than that, if you bought more than that, you could lose your social security. So you lose your welfare. So there's this weird conflict between people who want it, who need it the most, want it, and having more liquidity and access to it, but at the same time it perpetuates this system.
Yeah.
I don't know how to deal with that conflict.
No, I understand exactly what you're saying. And it is true for the average Argentinian that in some cases, this can be a lifeline. I get that. But it's important to look at the big picture here. And the big picture is that countries like Argentina and also Lebanon and several countries throughout the world have been targeted by economic warfare for a very long time. Argentina is a very good example. You could argue it began in the 70s and the 80s, and with the economic policy. I mean, when Argentina was a military dictatorship, some of the financial policies they adopted were completely insane. You had a neoliberal in power during the 90s who was very bad for Argentina, in my opinion, Carlos Menem. And then you had their economic collapse in 2001, which, again, you could argue was a direct consequence of a lot of those policies, both of the dictatorship and of Menem's presidency. And then you have the IMF come in and all these other entities. And what they try and do after the 2001 economic collapse is have Argentina engage in things like debt for land swaps, debt for resources swaps. And this has been going on not just in Argentina, but lots of, most of Latin America, arguably, for a very long time. And it's a resource grab.
Yeah.
And, some of what we allude to in this piece and what we hope to allude to in an upcoming reports and a book is that a lot of the people that I've written about and that Mark's written about and that we've written about together are the engineers of that expressly. And by blowing out Latin American debt in the 80s and 90s, it was a way to basically yoke Latin America to the United States or more broadly, a lot of the transnational economic interests that are based in the United States, like Wall Street banks, for example. They engineered a lot of this, and so the situation in Argentina now didn't just come out of nowhere. And obviously, Argentina's central bank has a lot of the blame, but that also didn't happen in a vacuum. Presidents appointed the heads of the central bank that made those policies. And even someone like Milei, who's railed against the Central Bank of Argentina, put former central bank president in a top post in his cabinet. So these are choices that have been made by politicians. As someone who's been and reported from the ground on Argentina and on Argentinian politics, the corruption there, they just don't even, there's politicians in Argentina that don't even try to hide how corrupt they are. It's just flagrant in some instances in a way I've never experienced anywhere else in the entire world. So I honestly think that what's happening in Argentina, yes, those people may need stable coins because of the current economic situation, but I think it was engineered to be that way. They were engineered into that position. And who benefits from that? The same people that I would argue created the solution and created the problem.
And those people, if we start to name names, are actually specifically connected very directly to the Zappo board. And Citi was a huge part of the Latin America debt restructuring in the 80s. You look at who was leading the Treasury in the 90s when something like a NAFTA happened. Who was there, Reed and Rubin and Summers, were all kind of part of this group. Who helped short the dollar, the Mexican peso after, the NAFTA trade agreement, really, basically demolishes the Mexican peso. You have the Soros protege, Joe Lewis, who makes millions of dollars off of shorting the peso, due directly to trade policy that was enacted by Summers and Reed. And Joe Lewis, of course, is affiliated, very directly with Deltec, which is sort of the bank of Tether. And you're beginning to kind of see like, John Reed was, hugely important. Robert Rubin was hugely important in the Treasury's decision to make this, and he jumps and goes and joins Citibank, who then takes over and merges with Mexico's largest bank. At basically, weeks after that happens, the same people that were deregulating the derivatives market in the United States that caused 2008, like a Larry Summers, they're ping-ponging back and forth from the private and public sector when it's beneficial for them to change policy and regulation at the international level. And whenever you're dealing with US dollar policy, it's global effects. And they're there, and then they leave and they go right to these really cushy private sector jobs. And then they all suddenly kind of coalesce around the Zappo advisory board. And they're here to, as Zappo says in a blog post, that stable coins are increasing the velocity of dollarization of the global south. I mean, it's something that they explicitly say is happening, and they are building the rails to do this.
And I just want to add really quick about dollarization. Mark and I feel like a lot of the goal of this is covert dollarization through stablecoins. And dollarization has happened in specific Latin American countries in the past, Ecuador, for example, El Salvador. And what happens then is that when they're dollarized, those countries lose their financial sovereignty. They become dependent on decisions of the Fed, and a lot of consequences come from that. So this is an effort by the same architects of even those instances in Ecuador and El Salvador to essentially foist the same thing on Latin America, but under a more, it doesn't seem like overt dollarization when it's stablecoins that aren't directly connected to the US government, but they are connected directly to the US Treasury system, for example. And then we also have some of these companies that Zappo are connected to, for example, that are also backed by this Endeavor company that is the focus of this piece, like Satellogic, which was also a key focus of our previous article, Debt from Above. And if you look at the board on Satellogic, you have the former head of the Treasury Department, Steve Mnuchin. You have Howard Lutnick of Cantor Fitzgerald, one of the main, people involved in the Treasury system, right? And then you have someone from the Rohatyn Group, and the Rohatyn Group is named for Nick Rohatyn, who basically led the Latin American debt policies of J.P. Morgan throughout the 1980s, netting the bank an insane amount of money and really aggravating the Latin American debt crisis as we know it today. So why are all those people on the board of the satellite company, for example? And why do these people pop up at Zappo? Why are these people that also are, involved in stablecoins like PayPal, for example, with PYUSD, why are they all over Endeavor, the PayPal mafia? I think it's so much that it's very hard to ignore and write it off as a coincidence.
And you didn't even mention Marcos Galperin being on the board of Satellogic, who's literally considered Endeavor's success story. Why is Tether giving Satellogic $30 million? Why is a stablecoin, money market basically investing in surveillance tech? I think it's worth discussing. And you start to look at, maybe the future is commodity-backed stable coins. Well, who owns all the commodities? If we do move away from the treasury market, well, it's these huge infrastructure players like an Eduardo Epstein or, these players in Argentina that are directly connected to Endeavor once again. So I think the stablecoin issuers are humongously important in finding places to place U.S. debt. I think they're right now the 18th largest holder of U.S. debt is stablecoin issuers, which is just outside like the top 10. Tether specifically in countries, which is still less than Hong Kong, but larger than Saudi Arabia, which is pretty wild. So, they're at 140 billion, something like that, 130 billion. I'm not exactly sure today. China, Japan, they're at like $1 trillion. So it's like they're like passing 10% of our biggest creditors in the world, these huge national interests. That's generally where you sell foreign debt, right? You sell it to like countries. Now we're selling them to companies with 30 employees that are now making billions of dollars a quarter just on interest payments from the short-term treasuries that they hold. And now we're seeing them, Tether, I think, is, they really market themselves as sort of this banking the unbanked, but then we're seeing where their money is flowing and what they're investing in. And they're investing in satellite companies
and brain machine interfaces,
Neurotech, the BlackRock Neurotech company. And we're seeing them sort of spread out into all of these kind of other groups. Again, banking has now become really about information, and data brokers are sort of the future of Silicon Valley, and they kind of have been for the last 20 years. And we've seen Silicon Valley, like a lot of these data brokers, like a Facebook, like a LinkedIn, they're not really they offer a free product. So where are they getting all of this money to be multi-billion-dollar companies? Well, they're taking user data and they're selling it to advertising companies, right? That's where Google makes all its money, Facebook, LinkedIn, all of these groups. Data has now become the commodity of the world. And so now we're seeing banking companies doing this exact same play, and they're selling banking companies. I think just today it came out that like AT&T lost like 110 million, customer data, files to hackers or whatever. That was hackers. But how many people have actually, lost their data just by clicking a user agreement that they didn't read that says all of your Facebook stuff, all of your messages, all your Twitter DMs, whatever, are now kind of out there in the world to be sold and advertised against you. I don't know if you have anything to add there.
Well, I would add about like the Tether play. I think it's really similar, but like in reverse of like what Elon Musk is doing. So Tether started off with money, right, with the stable coin. Now they're going into satellites and brain chips. Musk is doing brain chips and satellites, and he took over a social network, arguably for the user data. And now he's turning or has made it very explicit his intentions to turn Twitter X into a bank that he hopes to be half of the financial system. Why is that happening? It's very odd. And then when you consider all these like PayPal link ups, well, of course, Musk being a co-founder of PayPal, it's all very like.
Yeah. And I did a conversation. I had to sit down with Walter Hessert, who's the head of strategy at Paxos, which does the issuance for PayPal stablecoin. And he told me specifically that he doesn't foresee actually USDT and USDC surviving oncoming regulatory environments. And yet he still sees trillions of dollars of highly regulated stablecoins being printed in the next few years. Well, what does that mean? What does trillions of dollars of highly regulated stablecoins being printed? What does that actually mean in effect? Well, it means trillions of dollars of U.S. treasuries being purchased. Ergo, we're seeing money printing, and we're seeing a perpetuation of demand for dollars and for U.S. debt through these, this newfound just hungry hippo of U.S. treasuries, whether it's the USDC hippo or the USDT hippo or the oncoming PYUSD hippo. They're just smashing U.S. debt as much as possible because there's so much demand for it. And then I think the other wrinkle to this too, which is kind of interesting, is, well, creating the regulatory environment for capital requirements. And we're seeing things kind of coming out where how crypto will be regulated with oncoming Basel III requirements. And, they're going to basically say you need to have X amount of dollars on your balance sheet if you want X amount of Bitcoin. And as Bitcoin appreciates, you actually need to grow your dollars because, Bitcoin is considered a liability on your on your balance sheet. So if Bitcoin goes to $100,000, $1 million, which, we're Bitcoiners, right? Of course that's going to happen, right? So when that happens, what does that mean? How much dollars is MicroStrategy going to have on their balance sheet? How many dollars is Tether going to have as now one of the biggest holders of Bitcoin as well? Xapo has like 50,000 Bitcoin. Coinbase Custody has, 500,000 Bitcoin or whatever. The ETFs now, BlackRock, 400,000 Bitcoin. When that happens, how many trillions of dollars of dollars are they going to have on their books? And now we're going to see basically these fintech companies basically offer as a service, hey, we'll print you these dollar tokens that will offset the liabilities on your balance sheet, and we'll charge you a fee for it. And here's $400 billion of Tether to put on your balance sheet to offset the appreciation of your dollars. And that's enabled by the public sector. That's government regulation. U.S. government regulating is sort of the important regulatory arm of the United States. we see Coinbase Custody, which bought Zappo's custodial system, is partnered with the DOJ. They do work with the DOD. They sell the Bitcoin seized by the U.S. government. And so these players are kind of establishing, well, hey, we set this up. This is what we want. We want Bitcoin to appreciate. And hey, you're going to need to hold a lot of dollars. We can sell this to you as a service. So, Zappo basically built the custody, highly secured custody for your Bitcoin. And now we can offer you the US dollar banking that uses stable coins, and we can sell it as a service to basically offset the liabilities on your balance sheet. In the same way, you use carbon credits to offset, the lights in your, high rise for your building. You can buy carbon credits to offset those losses and be a green company. You can offset the liabilities of your Bitcoin holdings with dollar tokens.
Okay. Just a couple more questions on this, and then I promise you, we will get into working through some of these key players. Okay. The risk to Bitcoiners, I'm specifically talking this one at you, Mark. You've probably thought about this a bit more, but Bitcoin is a great tool to perpetuate this dollar hegemony and to ensure there's like a liquid, constant supply of dollars and to support the treasury market. Is it a temporary need? Is Bitcoin serve as a temporary tool? We've seen these various kind of attempts at new legislation, which means you can't custody your Bitcoin. You can't have, they call them self-hosted wallets.
Mm-hmm.
No, they failed. But do you think this is an attempt to kind of have their cake and eat it, to be able to print unlimited dollars using Bitcoin as the vehicle, but not allowing any kind of freedom with that Bitcoin as well? It's almost like they found this gift. They want to use it, but they don't want you to have the freedom aspects that come with it. And do you think ultimately this will cause the death of Bitcoin? Or in some ways, do you think ultimately this is what's going to create the success of Bitcoin and destroy the dollar itself? Because I can see a path for both.
Yeah, I think that the Bitcoin dollar system is basically taken taken the world economy sort of out from underneath this like dichotomy of commodity and currency, and we're kind of in this new realm where Bitcoin can sort of service as both. And they're desperately trying to keep it as a commodity and push the dollar as the currency to sort of be the liquid market there. I think that the powers that be need Bitcoin, and I think that we actually have an advantage right now where they need it very badly. In the same way that Bitcoin banks the unbanked in the global South or in Africa, and it empowers them financially, it also does that for these absolute ghouls that are fraud and evil people, I would say, frankly. It does the same thing. It's the same. That's why Bitcoin is still interesting to me and is still a powerful tool and a means to an end, despite the fact that, hey, wow, now we're connecting this to some of the worst groups of sexual blackmail people that have ever, in modern history that we've ever found out, right? So I think that they need Bitcoin. And I think that actually gives us, that's why I think it's really important. And we've been really focusing on this work so intensely right now because it's so important, because this is actually a moment where, they have to inflate the price of Bitcoin to perpetuate the dollar based on this metric that we're looking at. So what does that mean? Well, that means that, us that have been in Bitcoin or that hold Bitcoin are going to see a little scratch, get into our wallets here, right? We're going to have a little bit of a war chest to do stuff with. So it's really important that we communicate that there is sort of an attempt to, I don't want to say co-opt Bitcoin, because I think Bitcoin is very agnostic itself as a protocol to anything that's happening underneath it. But there's sort of an opportunity here that, hey, maybe they made a little bit of a mistake here. If you do take this angle that maybe it was created by intelligence or from a government or whatever, I think ultimately it doesn't matter. But we got some funds and Bitcoin, like all money, is just a means to an end. It's a medium of exchange. It's a bargaining tool. So what are we going to do as Bitcoiners that were here that got funds to, what are we going to build? What systems are we going to perpetuate and build for our kids and our kids' kids? How are we going to take this moment, which is all the things that we talk about, this very important, new financial system occurring, it gives us all an opportunity to do something here. So I think it's important that we, arm ourselves with what's going on and the truth, and then take our funds and start putting it towards sustainable systems that really perpetuate freedom and get us out from underneath the panopticon of intelligence and of government entities sort of being these financial terrorists, frankly, across the world. So like now here we are, we have an opportunity to do something. Like, what are we going to do? What's up?
Yeah, so like on that note, a lot of the talking points by prominent Bitcoin influencers for some time has been like, this is a solution to irresponsible central bank policy, government fiscal policy, and things like that, and a debt-based monetary system in general, fiat, what have you. And so, what are the implications then of this system that's aiming to yoke the dollar to that and use it to perpetuate the dollar? I think people should seriously be asking themselves, because we're, right now you have like Bitcoin only companies taking lots of money from Tether and being like, we're going to use the dollar to make Bitcoin stronger and stuff. But you can't do that and then also be like, fiat bad, central bank bad, and then just essentially team up with that same system. I mean, it just seems kind of weird, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so, personally.
All right, let's try and work through this spider web. Yeah. I want to start with intelligence agencies because I'll start with you, Whitney. You've obviously done a lot of work previously investigating intelligence agencies, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people work at them consider themselves the good guys, trying to make the world a better place. I equally know you are probably one of the most skeptical people in the world of intelligence agencies and the pervasive influence they have on society, the world. And so specifically with how they've started to infiltrate capital markets, can we talk about what you've seen there and compare it? So to give people like comparisons, let's try and compare it as best as possible to how they've done the same with, say, the big social media giants, the Twitters, the Facebooks, etc.
Sure. Okay, so in the case of like U.S. intelligence, if you go back to the very beginning, and there's even CIA like deputy directors that have said that, it was all Wall Street people at the beginning. It was Wall Street lawyers, it was Wall Street bankers. And since that point, from the genesis of the CIA, there's been revolving doors between CIA and Wall Street that have continued up until today. And really, you could look at the CIA as a public-private enterprise in some sense. It's a public security agency, but it's more or less functioned throughout its history as Wall Street's secret police. That's why its earliest coups, for example, like its first coup in Guatemala, was done on behalf of United Fruit, a major multinational corporation headquartered in the United States, which interestingly enough was later acquired by Leon Black's father, and then Leslie Wexner's business mentor.
I know that name.
Yeah. And then you also have, like the coup in Iran, over like Anglo-American oil, like them losing their holdings there. The coup in 1973 in Chile, you can argue it was because of efforts to nationalize copper and all these largely Western mining companies losing out, and then they come in and do a coup and what have you. It's really been symbiotic for some time. And I think, as we moved into the information age, the CIA saw an opportunity. Well, let me back up a little bit. The internet from the very beginning was, it originally started as ARPANET, a project of the Pentagon. And for anyone that really wants to know about that history, I would highly recommend the book Surveillance Valley by Yasha Levine. It was essentially created in Vietnam as a counterinsurgency program. That was the goal of it, by the same people that were involved in things like the Phoenix program, which was the first instance of military intelligence, at least U.S. military intelligence, using databases to come up with names of dissidents and then assassinating them. And a lot of them weren't actually dissidents, like suspected dissidents or neighbors of dissidents and all of this stuff. And then from Phoenix program, it goes, all these CIA-backed dictatorships, like, Pinochet in Chile, for example, Operation Condor, use the exact same system. And they've been building these systems with the internet even before the modern internet as we use it now existed. And so a lot of these there were efforts early on to king make the companies who would come to dominate the internet. And that has happened. It's just a matter of public record. If you look at the biggest companies in big tech, I've done work about how Facebook was essentially launched as a resurrection of a failed DARPA program called LifeLog by the same person that resurrected the failed DARPA program, Total Information Awareness, one of the most insane surveillance proposals ever in US history, resurrected as Palantir. You can thank Peter Thiel for that, co-founder of PayPal. And a lot of these other companies that have become huge, Google, for example, there's a good article by Nafez Ahmed written on by Insert when he published at Insurge Intelligence called "How the CIA Made Google." If you look at a lot of these companies, you will find intelligence agencies at the beginning. Palantir, I mentioned earlier, took In-Q-Tel money, developed very closely with the CIA. It began at PayPal. It's a PayPal spinoff, Palantir is. Oracle, another huge company in Silicon Valley. Larry Ellison, before he started Oracle, was working on Project Oracle at the CIA on databases and was the infrastructure for Oracle as we know it now. A lot of these, there's been a lot of symbiosis between intelligence agencies and these big companies for a long time, and they couldn't have done it without venture capital. And that's arguably why the CIA launched In-Q-Tel in the late 90s, because they wanted to become big players in Silicon Valley. Because when you decide, who the kingmakers are, well, there's a lot of things actually to be said about that. So what I mentioned earlier about like Total Information Awareness, this is a program that was just deemed so insane in the early 2000s that essentially every mainstream media publication railed against it and rights group railed against it. But then when they relaunched the same program essentially as a private entity, as a private sector entity, no one complained. And so the CIA for a long time and other intelligence agencies have followed this exact playbook, specifically Israeli intelligence. When you move into the private sector, you can get away with a lot more than you can in the public sector sometimes, depending on what you're trying to do. And so there have been efforts to do that, I would argue, for a very long time. And if you look at how these big tech companies have developed, and, for example, revelations from the Snowden leaks, just like how the extent to which these private companies, how much of your data that they're selling or passing to U.S. intelligence for warrantless surveillance. I mean, they've been collaborators of this for a very, very long time. And I think there really hasn't been enough scrutiny of that. And I would really argue that a lot of these companies operate more often than not as intelligence fronts. And it's kind of gotten to the point, too, where in US specifically, the people behind these very big tech, the biggest of the big tech companies, are also the main donors to the two US political parties. Right. You have like Peter Thiel on the Republican side, you have Reid Hoffman on the Democrat side, and Eric Schmidt on the Democrat side. I mean, they fund our politicians and they dominate our private sector infrastructure, especially as we've been forced to be more online, specifically since the COVID era. And the goal is to have things digitalize even further and have it all be on these people's systems and have us become completely dependent on their infrastructure. And these people are in bed with intelligence. And even aside from the intelligence connections, they have a lot of dirty laundry. Why did Jeffrey Epstein have connections with almost every big tech oligarch in the United States? I mean, not enough people have bothered to ask that question. Why were so many of them subpoenaed during the JP Morgan Epstein case in the US Virgin Islands that ended up being settled? I forget how much JP Morgan paid to make it all go away, but a lot of money.
And I think this idea of the intelligence, sort of going into the private sector in order to sort of like, whitewash away, public, disgust at these services, you could also sort of look at, well, hey, is that exact same thing playing out in the digital dollar sphere? Everyone is all hoorah, no, down, CBDs suck, and this is so bad, but no one gives a shit that these intelligence linked companies are building digital dollars that have $120 billion worth of liquidity. No one cares. And so is this idea of the CBDC as a digital dollar sort of a red herring? Why are they moving into the private sphere? Oh, is it because they actually retain more rights to restrict user access and the right to transact and blacklisting?
Yeah.
You can do more of that as a private sector entity than you can as the public sector.
And it's already happened. I mean, Bank of America illegally gave a ton of user data and financial transaction data to people, to the federal government on January 6th. And you have J.P. Morgan debanking people. One of the most notable, I guess it was last year, was Dr. Mercola, who was just taken off, and his whole team really was debanked by J.P. Morgan. No explanation. I mean, they can do that, and people be like, "Oh, it's a private company; it's their choice." And when the government does it, it's a little bit different, right? So basically, what we have here is a global public-private partnership, and when it's convenient for this particular group, they move into the public sphere, and when it's convenient, they move into the private sphere. That's why you have the revolving door. It's all been intertwined and tied together for a very long time. And now that's why we're being pushed into this new era where it's overt, the stakeholder capitalism era, the era of the public-private partnership, which is, the whole thing of the World Economic Forum and all of that, what they've been promoting since they came into existence in the 70s.
Yeah, so I'm wondering how this slippery slope even happens, because you'll know as well as me, Mark, there are some people considered very respected Bitcoiners who are heavily involved in Tether,
Sure.
working for Tether, helped found Tether.
Sure.
And although other supporters of Tether, again, very well respected people.
Sure.
There are people integrating Tether into wallets and etc. But I'm also pretty aware that Tether hasn't really shied away from admitting that I can't remember exactly what they said. They share data or they can freeze accounts, but they've been pretty open about the fact that they are. I don't even know. I don't want to word it wrong.
They partnered with the FBI. They've integrated chain analysis, which is InQtel funded. And literally, Paolo has said, one of Tether's goals is to continue the economic hedgement of the U.S. dollar globally. I mean, he's literally said that as much.
And I wonder how the slippery slope works. Is it you're a Bitcoiner? There is a demand for a dollar. The availability of dollar to trade in and out of Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody invents it. Its usage explodes and grows. You get a tap on the shoulder one day, and it's like, look, you got two choices. Either one, we're going to close this down and send you to jail, or two, you provide us with all your data. And so you got this weird conflict of choices, because like I say, pretty well respected, not just Paolo, but like pretty well respected Bitcoiners are integrating Tether into wallets, and are fairly openly supportive of Tether existing. And so, are we turning a blind eye? Is it a slippery slope? Do you become captured? I mean, is it all of the above?
A lot of people forget at the beginning that Brock Pierce was a formative part of the founding of Tether, who was Epstein affiliated. He ran the DEN network with Mark Collins Rector, who also started Concentric Networks, which was a huge ISP in the start of the 90s that actually did work in the Treasury Department with BNY Mellon, working on payment systems. Brock Pierce, was arrested for having a huge stash of I'll call it CP, and being kind of arrested for trafficking. Or charged rather, with Mark Collins and Chad Shackley. And there's a lot of intelligence connections immediately.
Can we add some context there? Look, I'm no fan of Brock Pierce. Sure. I think he's a dick. But at the time, and I've seen the document, he was a teenager himself, right?
Yeah, he was a Disney guy.
Yeah, no, but the feeling I got from the documentary when I saw it, that he is also potentially an abuse victim as well as maybe a perpetrator.
Well, I think that's a common trope. Abuse is sort of a communicative disease, I would say, and so why is this?
You misunderstand my point. So he was never prosecuted on that. He was arrested, right?
Yeah.
He himself was a teenager and also potentially a victim of abuse in that scenario. I just don't want people just to hear that and go and think of Brock Pierce as just like some guy in his 40s who was arrested. I just want the context of that in there.
Sure.
Because I'm not defending him. And also on the Epstein thing, one of the things I did want to ask you, and we might as well deal with it now, Whitney, is Epstein connected is a weird term for me, in that clearly Epstein was a pedophile, clearly had a black book of people that we're still yet to fully see who are connected with him. But there is a world where pre-exposure to Epstein being a pedophile, someone could be introduced to him at a meeting, told he's somebody who can invest, and they've invested in his company. They've got no idea who he is, that he has his pedophile island, and that himself is like sexually abusing people. Yet because they've taken money from him, having met him, before this is all exposed, they're now called Epstein connected. And so like it becomes this thing where it can follow you around when you innocently accepted money. Mm-hmm. Do you understand the point I'm trying to make?
Yeah. I absolutely see what you're saying, but I think, people that actually follow and read my work on Epstein. So I would argue there has been an effort from the day he was arrested in 2019 to frame the spectrum of Epstein discussions specifically about the sex trafficking and the abuse. And Epstein's career was much larger than that. I have argued consistently that more than anything else, Epstein was involved in shadow banking, suspect currency trading, and was arguably really a financial terrorist.
Okay.
Just as much as he was a sex trafficker. So I would argue that a lot of the connections, mainly in like for example, in his Black Book of contacts that is publicly available, for example, a lot of those I would argue are based around a lot of these financial connections. Some of them are not. So if you look at the Black Book, Epstein's butler went around and circled names of people who were involved explicitly, according to him, in the sex trafficking stuff. And most of the names are not circled, right? So when I say Epstein connected, I hope that people understand or have taken the time to either read my work or watch my interviews on Epstein, because I've explicitly said that not everyone associated with Epstein is a pedophile, and people have tried to do that and make Epstein pedophile only, right? And obviously he was that, but he was a lot more than that. And I think, the fact that there's been so little interest, for example, in his documented role in the collapse of Bear Stearns in 2008, his role in money laundering in connection with banks like BCCI, which were also sex trafficking prepubescent kids for elites of the Emirates in the 1980s and stuff. There's been no interest in looking into that kind of stuff, no interest in looking at his ties with big tech, for example, his efforts to rebrand as a big tech and also fintech investor. And in the case of Brock Pierce and Epstein, this happened after his first arrest, the meeting. And Pierce has said that all of his conversations with Epstein were related directly to cryptocurrency. So someone like Epstein, and with the financial history of Epstein, his interest arguably in cryptocurrency is to continue to engage in the same criminal and bad financial behavior that he had done for the decades prior. So whatever he was talking to Pierce about from Epstein's motives would have been to find ways to use cryptocurrency or help develop and guide the cryptocurrency industry in ways that would help enable the activity that he had consistently engaged in for decades and decades and decades. Yeah. Was Pierce willingly enabling that? I don't know, but I think, it's worth asking those questions, because in the past, like in the case of Din, he's kept questionable company. Was he an abuse victim? And in that gray area, it's quite possible. I've argued in the case of Ghislaine Maxwell that she sort of could potentially have fallen in that category as well, because I think there is some evidence that she was abused by her father, Robert Maxwell, in that way. And then sort of he died, and she sort of, instead of him being her, handler, I guess you could say, she's sent to Epstein, who, is alleged to have worked with Robert Maxwell in intelligence-related financial stuff in the 1980s. And then she, basically becomes the person helping him arrange his stuff and basically serving a lot of the same purposes that she helped her father do, but instead it's with Epstein.
I can't put numbers or percentages on it, but I don't know if it's a majority or a large part. But I think now the strong narrative around Epstein is not financial terrorist. It is pedophile.
That was explicitly done on purpose.
Yeah, and fine. But what I mean is, it's good to get that narrative clear, because if people are, I think if they hear Epstein connected, they think, oh, are you in the flight logs? Did you travel to the island? Did you have business dealings with him post first arrest in 2019?
But not everyone on the plane is necessarily a pedo either, but I think, going on a plane with him and being around him and being affiliated with him suggests that you're involved in some of the stuff he was doing, and it was not exclusively sex trafficking.
Yeah.
If anything, I would argue that sex trafficking and sex blackmail was really like a side thing for Epstein.
side gig, his side hustle.
And that his real job was currency manipulation. And that's why you have like letters to heads of state being like, I want to talk to you about Jeffrey Epstein and currency stabilization, when that exact administration was developing a plan to stabilize Mexico's currency.
Mm-hmm.
And someone tied up in the cabal of currency traders that Epstein was in, according to like the New York Times and stuff, was the person who shorted the peso and made millions of dollars.
And Epstein visits the Clinton White House 17 times. The first time he's invited, it's by this Rubin, Rubin, which, you know, Robert Rubin being the head of the Treasury at that time.
Well, not at that time. He was head of the National Economic Council and became head of the Treasury. But he's the first guy to invite him in, essentially. And Robert Rubin was previously head of Goldman Sachs, which has a lot of connections both to Steve Mnuchin's family, and that's where Steve Mnuchin was originally, and also to a lot of this network of billionaires that were sort of included Epstein's patron, Leslie Wexner. Sort of the group of oligarchs that Wexner associates himself with were largely responsible for the rise of people like Robert Rubin within Goldman Sachs. And Goldman Sachs has a very intimate connection with a lot of those, families in that particular group, which the Wall Street Journal named the mega group in the late 90s. And this includes the Bronfman. So, for example, the top people, the Weinbergs, for example, who ran Goldman Sachs for a long time, were on Seagrams. They managed trusts for the Bronfman family. And things like that, along with, mob-connected figures like Lou Wasserman of MCA, who also had intelligence ties and backed, most of the main presidential candidates of the latter half of the 20th century in the United States and made Ronald Reagan's political career happen.
And the connections of Goldman directly with Brock, also with Steve Bannon being a longtime member there, coming in and taking over at IGE, which is the company that he ran before that was selling World of Warcraft gold. That was sort of the introduction to a lot of these guys into currency manipulation in the digital sphere. They were running, after Brock got arrested, all that stuff kind of went down. We'll call it nebulous if you want. I totally get that. But when that went down, he kind of, went into the digital sphere and he got really involved and basically cornered and dominated the market of digital goods, kind of before Bitcoin was the thing in the 2000s in World of Warcraft. It's actually kind of a common story for a lot of these folks, like the Teal fellow Vitalik Buterin, who started Ethereum. He got into, doing Ethereum as sort of this unstoppable digital currency thing because his character got nerfed on World of Warcraft, and he was very upset that he lost, damage points or whatever on his casting. But so Bannon comes in and actually replaces him directly as the head of the company when he stepped down.
And, someone like Steve Bannon, too, was also involved around the same time that Pierce was associating with Epstein, very involved in trying to rehabilitate Epstein's image as he was moving to reinvent himself as like a science and tech investor. Yeah. So like, why are these people making these decisions? I mean, they obviously didn't care, because even at that point in time, after his first arrest, Epstein described himself as being socially radioactive. So these are people that are just like, no, that's fine. And like, we see something useful in you and we want to help you make that rebrand. Why? I would argue it has to do with the role that Epstein played in finances. And that is also the reason, why Leslie Wexner chose him to basically run and manage all of his money. Because right before Epstein came into the Wexner circle, Wexner's tax lawyer was shot in the face in broad daylight. The police investigation document says that it was organized crime in Leslie Wexner that did it, and that Leslie Wexner is linked to organized crime. That report was destroyed. The murder is listed as unsolved, and the murder happened the day before the lawyer was going to testify to the IRS about unspecified tax havens. And then Epstein sweeps in and starts untangling Wexner's complicated finances at the Limited. And then you have the Limited at that time having a figure on the board named Alan Tesler, who was involved with aspects of the Promise software scandal, which is where Israeli intelligence and the CIA essentially put a backdoor into like every security agency. And Robert Maxwell was intimately involved with that. But Alan Tesler, the architect of that, one of them was a man named Earl Bryan, and Alan Tesler was a lawyer for Earl Bryan and also on the board of the Limited and involved with all really this whole network at the same time. I mean, a lot of very weird stuff is happening in this crowd. But if you look at what they were doing, which, I do in detail in my book, it's a mix of financial crime and trying to dominate tech. And that's why you have like the Maxwell sisters, after Robert Maxwell died, the twins, create the first search engine and things like that. And Isabel Maxwell goes on to be a major player in Israel's high-tech system. Christine Maxwell teams up with a CIA top guy for... I forget, the CIO of the CIA, to develop a company called Gilead that was basically being used after 9/11 to analyze all of this war on terror data and all of this stuff. I mean, it's just very...
It's endless.
Well, it's important to understand that there was a explicit effort to limit the discussion about Epstein, to make it just about the sex crime, so you don't look at anything else, right?
And he specifically was managing money for the Bronfmans during the insider trading. That was why he came down.
Well, it was
correct?
suspected because Bear Stearns had the Bronfmans as a tax client, and Epstein left Bear Stearns because of, allegedly, because he was the SEC was investigating an insider trading scandal involving the Bronfmans' owned company Seagram's. And the SEC was tipped off that Epstein had information about that, and they went to question him at Bear Stearns, and then he was let go. And there's a lot of, he gave different reasons as to why he was let go, and so did the bank. But there's, a significant body of reporting supporting that it was related to that insider trading scandal, which also involved people from Drexel Burnham Lambert and the junk bonds. And you see a lot of Drexel people swimming around Epstein afterwards, like Leon Black, for example, who led their mergers and acquisitions department and were involved in, all sorts of financial criminality.
Leon Black's the name that it seems to be one of the most prominent names that has come out of his Black Book. And there's suspicions about some significant loan that he gave, or amount of money he gave to Epstein to manage. I seem to remember.
Yeah, I forget the exact figure, but it's astronomically high. And also Epstein was managing his family foundation. And Epstein also, was a trustee on the Wexner Foundation and involved in all sorts of philanthropic efforts. And in that same period of time, he's visiting the White House regularly. And he's going on official Microsoft business trips with Microsoft's chief technology officer. And then later in 2001 tells the UK's Evening Standard that he made all of his money because of ties to Donald Trump, Leslie Wexner, and Bill Gates. And people act like Bill Gates and Epstein didn't meet until 2011, when he was no longer affiliated with Microsoft. There's been a huge cover up of all of these other connections of Epstein there. I feel like my whole purpose as it relates to Epstein research is to make people aware of that, because, I would argue that the reason Epstein went to prison and all of that stuff happened is because there was a major factional issue within this group, and there were particular interests that wanted Epstein out, and they wanted to demonize him and make him look very bad, but they didn't want enough to come out that it would implicate stuff they were also involved in or had previously been involved in the past.
And just a fun little note on this whole thing is one of the co-signees of the J. Epstein Foundation is this guy, Bill Elkis, who kind of came out of the Idea Labs group in the 90s. And they were the first founders of PayPal extremely early on. They were the first people. So he was directly connected to Epstein right there. He goes on and founds Clearstone with William Quigley, who is one of the co-founders of Tether also. So we have these kind of direct connections there to PayPal, to Epstein, to Tether. It's kind of all, interestingly coming together.
Like Epstein was involved with cryptocurrency discussions with Pierce. He gave an interview where he raved about the potential of Bitcoin, not as a currency, but as a digital asset. In 2017, Elizabeth Stark has come out and said that, Epstein tried to give her money. She said no. Why was Epstein trying to invest in Lightning Labs and all of this stuff? Like, what's going on here? Why was he so close to Joy Ito at MIT Media Lab? And he was involved in launching the digital currency initiative. Did Epstein influence that at all? We don't know. And there's been really very little media interest in finding out any of the answers to those questions.
Is Epstein Satoshi? No, just kidding.